The next two hypotheses are the monitor hypothesis and the effective filter hypothesis. According to Kreshn, the conscious language learning monitors the output. So the conscious language learning is a process which basically monitors the output of that language. It claims the only function of learning within second language acquisition is as an editor or monitor for language use produced by the acquired system, as well as to produce grammatical forms not yet acquired. So basically it functions, the learning functions as monitor. It checks the output. The process reduces errors as consciously learned rules are applied to an utterances before producing it or after production through self-correction. So this monitor helps the learner to reduce error with the understanding of the acquired grammatical rules and facilitates the self-correction if the errors are produced. Monitor hypothesis is also divided into three types of ways to use it. We have monitor overusers. We have monitor underusers. And the third is the optimal monitor users. Monitor overusers are the ones where the learners are focusing a lot on the acquiring of grammatical rules, and there is monitor in use all the time. This affects the fluency of the learner. Underusers are the learners who do not do self-correction, who are not even aware of the errors that they make while they're producing utterances. They are relying primarily on the previously acquired system. So this is what we mean by monitor underusers. The optimal monitor users are the where the users or learners are using the monitor effectively. They take time to think and then come up with their expressions and utterances, and they are aware of the usage of the correct forms of the target language. Conditions to apply to the monitor hypothesis are time, focus on form, and knowledge of rules. Learner of second language needs time to process the information and produce the correct output. He or she needs to focus on the understanding of the correct use of form and not the meaning. Knowledge of rules are very important, the understanding of the grammatical rules of the target language, so to come up with the correct usage of the target language. According to effective filter hypothesis, filters can affect how well we acquire comprehensible input. So in order to acquire comprehensible input, you need to have filter-free process of acquisition. Now filter over here are referred to as motivation, attitude, self-confidence, and anxiety. Kreshn feels that in order to have a comprehensible input, we should not, or our understanding should not simply caught up in a filter. We need to have the removing of the filter or removing of all the obstacle which can hinder our understanding of the comprehensible input. And according to him, motivation, a level of motivation, one's attitude towards the target language, self-confidence or self-esteem, and anxiety, they can act as filters in terms of our understanding of the comprehensible input. We will now show you a video clip of Stephen Kreshn, that how he is explaining the idea of comprehensible input and the effective filter hypothesis.
I'd like to discuss one more hypothesis before we move on to literacy, and this is a very important one called the affective filter hypothesis. Research in language acquisition has concluded that there are several factors that relate to success in language acquisition, and I'm going to list them here on your screen. One factor is motivation. Students who are more motivated do better in language acquisition. Those of you who study this know that it's a little more complicated than this, but this is a good approximation. Second, self-esteem. Probably the dominant concept today in popular psychology. Students with more self-esteem, more self-confidence do better in language acquisition. Third, anxiety. And here the correlations are negative. The lower the anxiety, the better the language acquisition. In fact, my hypothesis is for language acquisition to really succeed, anxiety should be 0. This has happened to you. Have you ever been in a situation, speaking a language that you may not speak very well, when the conversation gets so interesting, you temporarily forget that you're using another language? If this is happening to you, that's when you're acquiring. When your focus is completely on the message, what the other person is saying, and your anxiety is temporarily gone. By the way, as an important footnote to this, I guess today we say sidebar, as a sidebar to all this, I'm not sure that 0 anxiety is right for everything. I'm sure it's good for a lot of things, but I'm not quite sure how far to push this. Speaking to you as a college teacher, speaking to you as a parent, I'm not all that free and easy. I think there are certain things in school children absolutely must learn. I think my students at the University of Southern California should suffer. We have hard classes, tough requirements. You don't do the work, you're out. I finally learned what they tried to teach us in educational psychology. The amount of drive or anxiety necessary to accomplish a task depends on the task. Sometimes we call facilitative anxiety is okay. I don't believe in torture, but sometimes a little anxiety is okay. Language acquisition, though, is different. For language acquisition to succeed, anxiety has to be directed somewhere else, not at the language. Frank Smith puts it this way: for the child to develop literacy, the child has to assume that she's going to be successful. The way we integrate this into the theory is like this. If the student isn't motivated, if self-esteem is low, if anxiety is high, if the student is on the defensive, if the student thinks the language class is a place where his weaknesses will be revealed, he may understand the input, but it won't penetrate. It won't reach those parts of the brain that do language acquisition. A block keeps it out. We call this block the affective filter. Here's how it works. Somewhere in the brain, Chomsky tells us, is a language acquisition device. Our job is to get input into the device. So that's input here. Low motivation, low self-esteem, high anxiety, the block goes up, the filter goes up, and the input cannot get in. This explains how it can be that we can have 2 children in the same class, both getting comprehensible input. One makes progress, the other doesn't. One is open to the input, the other's closed. Let me now try to summarize everything I've said in the last 10, 15 minutes or so, and I'll summarize it in one sentence, and we'll wonder why it took me that long. We acquire language in one way, and only one way, when we get comprehensible input in a low anxiety environment.
So we saw that Stephen Krishnan explained motivation, attitude, self-confidence, and anxiety as effective filter in the process of comprehensible input. He thinks that the process should be such which should facilitate opening up to the input and not being closed to the input. According to him, there is only one way when we can get in comprehensible environment, that is, we acquire the language or get the incomprehensible input in a low anxiety environment. To conclude, Krishna's monitor hypothesis refers to the belief that our conscious language learning acts as an editor or monitor for our output. According to the effective filter hypothesis, motivation, anxiety, attitude, and self-confidence can act as effective filter in the process of second language acquisition.